I'm actually going to read some of this. I don't usually read the papers that I'm supposed to read, but I finished writing this at about 4 a.m. last night, and I haven't actually read it yet. I think it makes sense. But I wanted to say something new, having this whole conference, and I didn't want to sort of regurgitate things. So what I thought to do was to relate some of the themes that I explored in my earlier work on debt with some of the more recent concerns I've had with the history of labor, and particularly wage labor, which I cover rather briefly in the new book on bullshit jobs, and specifically talk about the commoditization of labor. We have this interesting situation nowadays where waged and to a lesser extent salaried labor remain the predominant ways of organizing work almost everywhere in the world at this point. But historically, if you look at the sort of broad historical sweep, while such arrangements often existed in many, perhaps most times and places, they were kind of unusual, even considered anomalous in most. And while there has been a lot of very good research on the history of such labor arrangements, it's actually really uncommon to see anyone put the pieces together in any sort of broad synthetic way. You often see books on different forms of labor in a certain region, or labor in the Indian Ocean, labor in medieval Northern Europe. But it's surprising how rarely they make that many general points. So I thought I would start by taking up some of the ideas about commoditization of labor that kind of came on me when I was pursuing the work on debt. And thus, I want to start with talking about bride wealth and bride price and that debate. And what I thought were one of the more, what I thought was one of the cooler points that I kind of came up with while I was researching debt, which is an intervention in an anthropological debate about the nature of bride wealth and dowry. And about the sort of power of debt to transform one into the other, transform what are essentially social currencies that are used when social currencies turn into commercial currencies. What are sort of social arrangements can become commoditized in ways that almost turn them into the opposite of what they had previously been. But to go from there, and that's largely about the commoditization of women's labor through much of history, through marriage systems, to talking about wage labor itself. So there's three parts. There's that, going for the role of debt in sort of dislodging labor from the sort of social nexuses in which it has been placed, seen from the perspective of marriage systems, but then seen from the perspective of wage labor itself, which has a very, very interesting history, and in many times and places, probably most, seems to emerge above all from within institutions of slavery. And then finally, to look at a case where wage labor definitely didn't emerge from within institutions of slavery in Northern Europe, and particularly England. And in that case, to look at the role of debt in redefining English agricultural, industrial, and commercial workers, not as creditors, but essentially as debtors to those they worked for. Now, let me start at the beginning. So part one is bride wealth, dowry, and just plain bride price. One of the less remarked arguments in debt, although, as I say, perhaps one of its more ambitious interventions in anthropological theory, I don't think anybody noticed because it's largely in the footnotes, was a critique of Jack Goody's famous argument of the opposition between bride wealth and dowry. I would see it as much as an expansion and slight modification of Goody's argument rather than in contradiction to it. I'm pretty sure Goody would see it as in contradiction with it. In fact, when people raised similar points, he argued against them. So I seem to be on the other side. Goody's core argument, I think, everyone has come to accept, which is about the distinction between bride wealth and dowry. And that actually, the whole anthropological debate on the subject can actually be traced back to a political question. In the 1930s, the League of Nations was holding a series of debates about whether the practice of what was then called bride price should be banned as a form of slavery. Does bride price actually mean people are selling women? As one might imagine, anthropologists were sort of called in as expert witnesses, testified, and Evans Pritchard in particular entered the argument to make a strong case that even in societies where people actually say things like, yes, I am buying a wife, they don't really mean it. Such statements are not to be taken literally, because even if payments only move in one direction, as they didn't necessarily. There's some places there's actually payments in both directions. The important thing is that things are moving around, but that would be the case often in Southeast Asia. In Africa, it was often things moved just one way from the wife takers to the wife givers. Even so, he argued, there's no sense of payment, and there were a number of criteria that were listed as why this does not resemble a payment. That if you were to buy, say, a cow, one was that both parties continue to have mutual rights and responsibilities, and so did their lineages and clans. Another was that if anything was actually being purchased in the case of bride wealth, and this is the period where they actually insisted that we get rid of the word bride price entirely and substitute bride wealth. If anything was really being purchased, the argument was, it was not the woman, but her fertility, more specifically the right of the wife-taker's lineage or clan to name any children of the union as their patrilineal descendants. So in that sense, women no way resembled as slaves, and slaves are by definition entirely detached from their natal web of social relations, whether by capture or purchase, and of course they don't have any rights but only responsibilities. And finally, this is really the clinching argument for a lot of people. If you're really buying a wife, then you could sell them, right? And in fact, there's pretty much no case in which someone who obtains a wife by bride wealth can then just sort of arbitrarily pass her on to others for a similar payment. Now, as a result, bride wealth payments were not banned. Anthropologists basically won the argument. The assumption was that bride wealth was not buying a wife or an exchange of gifts meant to create social relations or to transform them, to establish or renew an alliance between two different groups. Now, Goody's work on production and reproduction, bride wealth and dowry, kind of takes off from that. And in particular, Goody was fascinated in particular by the anomaly of Ethiopia. The fact that, when you talk about African systems of kinship and marriage, Ethiopia seems to be the one place where almost all the rules that make Africa different than Eurasia don't apply. So, instead of bride wealth, they do dowry, and they have plow agriculture instead of hoe agriculture. There's not any number of different ones. I could go into having to do with cuisine and everything else. But his big point was that it all has to do with technology and population density. Actually interesting, it's a purely materialist argument at root, which has been widely accepted even amongst anthropologists who generally don't go for that kind of thing. What he basically says is that where you have hoe agriculture rather than plow agriculture, you have low population densities. You don't need heavy-duty technologies to produce crops, and therefore it's not land but labor that's at a premium. Bride wealth seems to correspond to those societies, and bride wealth, it's not the fact that one is transferring a property in order, to the wife takers in order to gain a woman. I mean, that does happen, he says, but actually, payments can move back and forth in different directions for different reasons. It sets up a nexus, but it's mainly about the allocation of labor. And the key thing for him is that bride wealth is passed back and forth by the generation above the couple that's getting married. So it's actually the lineages or the descent groups, clans, whatever they might be, that they're part of who are rearranging things together, because in such a situation where land is easy to come by, and where women are doing most of the agricultural work, or either a lion's share of it or all of it, as they are in many African societies, female labor is really important. And clans basically have a range of options, starting from trying to keep their daughters around, which is the matrilineal option. In fact, in such societies where you don't have a bride wealth custom, you tend to have matrilineal, to ones where there's various forms of bride service, and finally, flat out bride wealth and polygyny, where you're trying to basically accumulate as many women as possible for your own clan. So essentially, these are arrangements made between the elders of various descent groups about the allocation of women's agricultural labor, he argues. Now, dowry is completely different because it's not just a reverse that dowry. It's the woman's family that's providing the wealth. Again, sometimes that's not even the case. What's really going on with dowry, he says, is that dowry is premature inheritance. When you have plow agriculture, that's usually because you have very high population densities. Land is at a premium, and there's various strategies to bring land together. Thus, while bride wealth societies tend to be exogamous, dowry societies tend to be endogamous. You tend to marry within the group. You tend to try to form marriage alliances which will keep property together. And women are not nearly as important as the dominant labor force in agriculture, which means that in many ways they're seen more as a mouth to feed, he argues, than as the core of your agricultural labor force. So as a result, daughters are typically had to be provided with some kind of resources when married off, either land of their own or something else that would take the burden of supporting her away from the husband's family. All right. Now, there are a lot of cases which are kind of intermediary. I actually was in a society like that when I did my own field work. In Madagascar, for example, they had both bride wealth and dowry. In fact, it came from the same thing. A husband's parents would pay a sum of money. It's called the vudi undri, or rump of a sheep, but actually it was a sum of money to the bride's family. And then the bride's parents would then immediately use that money to buy furniture, bedding, pots and pans, and other necessities for the new household, which they would then give to the bride. Or goody, this would just be a form of indirect dowry. The point is that the money ends up in a conjugal fund for the newly married couple. So anyway, that's the broad argument, which, since this isn't an audience of anthropologists, I thought I'd go over it. I can't assume that people know the details. Now, where the argument hits the shoals, I think, is in its treatment of social class, or really its non-treatment of social class. Stanley Tambaya, who co-wrote one of the key original texts, Bride, Wealth, and Dowry with Goody in 1973, very soon began to raise objections to certain aspects of this based on his own detailed knowledge of the South Asian ethnography, where he pointed out that there's a lot of urban societies in Eurasia or rural societies which are part of large urban civilizations where you have dowry at the top of the social ladder and something that looks a lot like bride wealth on the bottom. As he points out, the sort of magnificent seclusion of upper caste women in India who often had to be provided with astronomical dowries to keep them kept in the style to which they were accustomed, was only made possible by the industrious labor of lower caste women who necessarily had to have completely different marriage arrangements. And this is a quote from excuse me, quote from Tambaya. It should be appreciated, as Goody failed to do in Production and Reproduction, that high caste male freedom from menial labor and the conspicuous removal of high caste females from public view are only possible because the system of rural production is predicated on the availability and exploitation of a low caste agricultural labor, both male and female. Moreover, women of these lower orders enjoy much greater freedom of movement outside their homes. Bride wealth rather than dowry payments are exacted on their marriages, thus accenting the greater economic value of their labor, and divorce, separation, and remarriage, including remarriage of widows, is frequently open to them. So, in some ways, they are more free. In most other ways, they are more oppressed. Goody actually rejected this argument, insisting that what seemed to be bride wealth here wasn't really bride wealth. It was actually indirect dowry. It ultimately ends up in the conjugal fund of the family in question. And there was a heated debate about this, but I think actually Tambaya doesn't really go far enough, because at times anyway, within these what he calls lower order circles, transactions really did come quite close to simply buying and selling women, and sometimes it actually did, there was buying and selling women because slavery was practiced. In fact, these were precisely the women who would otherwise be most likely to become sex workers, debt peons, or wage laborers, so that is, who were subject to being commoditized in other ways. This allowed members of the elite to denounce the poor for buying and selling off their daughters, and justified ever greater sequestering of upper caste women, who, of course, had to be protected from any possible association with such lowly practices. And what Tambaya is sort of alluding to here, although, as I say, he doesn't take it as far as he might, is a pattern that can be observed in almost all the great Eurasian civilizations. There's a kind of a double push and pull of a commoditization on the bottom and greater seclusion on the top. The greatest detailed evidence we have for marriage transactions from anywhere is from Bronze Age Mesopotamia, starting in Sumer, going on through Old Babylonian material, where in the earliest texts there seems to have been something like what I observed in Madagascar, actually. A gift by the groom's family to the brides, which is ostensibly bride wealth, was actually used to provide for a lavish wedding feast and for silver jewelry, which the bride would then wear. So basically she would show up at the wedding sort of dressed in money, and she would have this as her fund to, if she, in case of emergencies, or if she wanted investment capital for business ventures, she would just use that. As the example implies, in this early period, women had a great deal of economic and social autonomy. And over time, however, and this is one of the remarkable things about the Middle Eastern texts, as time goes on, the sort of autonomy and freedom of women to take part in public or even private life just continually declines. That freedom is steadily eroded. Wealthy women were sequestered, even veiled. Poorest women really were actually simply bought and sold. Now, one thing that I argue in the book is that in societies that don't have commercial markets, but merely social currencies, as I call them, it's really only physical violence, war, feuds, slave raids, that can act as that kind of a wedge that dislodges women, sometimes also children, from the webs of debt and mutual responsibilities in which they're typically embedded, allowing what Levi-Strauss famously called the exchange of women to turn into something that actually did resemble commodity exchange. In societies that do have commercial markets, monetary debt, which of course is backed up ultimately by the threat of force, can have the same effect. And certainly that appears to be what happened in the case of Sumer and Mesopotamia more generally, where at first there would have been no question of a man whose family had paid the traditional sum in grain and silver to acquire a wife, then being able to transfer her to someone else. So you could say, as they did in the bride wealth argument, he wasn't actually buying a wife because he couldn't sell her, right? However, all of that changed the moment he took out a loan. Since in the event of default, you could lose your wife. In fact, the normal practice was first they go for your fields and vineyards, if you have those, they go for your flocks. After that, you have children and ultimately one spouse who are taken away as sureties. Now, that, of course, means assigning a monetary value to human beings, which in turn was made conceptually easier by the existence of chattel slavery, which wasn't demographically that important, but I think it was conceptually very important at that time. So what I suggested in the book was that this threat of alienating human beings from their families and communities set off a series of other changes which had disastrous consequences for the freedom of Mesopotamian women more generally. First of all, using family members as surety for loans gradually became a precedent for other forms of commoditization. Stahl, for instance, remarks that, quote, in Nuzi, the bride price was paid in domestic animals and silver, amounting to a total value of 40 shekels of silver. There is some evidence that it was equal to the price of a slave girl. So you're actually paying the same thing in bride price as you would if you were just buying someone. this confluence is not surprising, since in that same city we have evidence of rich men paying cut-rate bride price to impoverished families to acquire a daughter who they could then adopt. So you pay the same price to adopt a daughter, who you can then use pretty much as you like, as concubine, nursemaid, servant, or simply marry her to one of your slaves. Another quote. The poorer the girl's parents, the more marriage resembles a real sale. Marriage arrangements in a city like Muzi indeed look like sales due to the poverty of the girl's parents, and giving a dowry there was a luxury of the wealthy. So not only is it dowry and bride price, dowry for the rich and bride price for the poor, it actually is bride price and not bride wealth. In other cities, adopted daughters, adopted in quotes here, were employed in industrial pursuits or set to work as prostitutes to provide an income for their adopters in retirement. Daughters were sold or taken as debt sureties, were often sexually exploited, became temple prostitutes or commercial sex workers, and this in turn set off a kind of puritanical reaction as men began to judge one another's honor by their ability to safeguard the sexual purity of their womenfolk and protect them from being taken away like this. Virginity is never actually mentioned in the early texts, and so it becomes an issue steadily in the midst of all of this. Bride wealth, even among wealthier families by the Old Babylonian period, came to be referred to as the price of a virgin. And this was increasingly meant literally because illegal deflowering of a virgin came to be considered a property crime against her father. You could pay an equivalent fine or compensation. Marriage came to be referred to as taking possession of a woman, the same word one would use for the seizure of goods. So this tendency to commoditize the bodies and services of poor women led to the sequestering even of rich women, who largely lost the ability to separate even from abusive husbands, and by the late Bronze Age would often not go out unveiled. I mean, there were never laws saying they had to go veiled. There are actually laws saying that poor women or prostitutes couldn't wear veils. But nonetheless, there was a clear dynamic whereby the commoditization of some women led to increasing sequestering of others. And I think that almost all the great Eurasian civilizations witnessed a similar dynamic between roughly 2500 and 1500 BC and 1500 AD. The class war between men was essentially fought out over the bodies of women, and the daughters of both rich and poor continually lost ground as a result. To take just one well-documented example, Chinese legends recorded in the Guangxi and elsewhere, I don't know how to pronounce that, report that coined money was first invented by benevolent emperors to redeem poor children who had been sold or taken away as debt pledges by the rich during times of famine. So such practices existed. Predatory lending, breakup of families was seen as a social issue, and the state was seen as taking an interest in fighting it. In fact, while the landed classes provided their daughters with dowries, bride price here too continued to be practiced by the poor, and it overlapped so strongly with slavery that state bureaucrats, who periodically tried to ban both, along with debt peonage, could hardly be blamed for concluding that all three were basically the same thing. One of the interesting things about Chinese slavery, and this was even more true of Korean slavery, in Korea in certain periods, they passed laws that men could not be enslaved, only women could be enslaved. In China, they never went quite that far, but very often, but it was typical that slavery was seen as something that happens to women and not to men. Now, it's interesting, if you look across Eurasia, I make the point that in what I call the sort of long axial age, chattel slavery was extremely common. Over the course of the Middle Ages, it's largely eliminated, at least as a factor in production. And it's transformed, you could say, into serfdom in the Christian West, restricted largely to household slavery in the Middle East, or military slavery, debt peonage and other forms of caste domination in South Asia. And in China, it's largely restricted to women. This is partly due to the peculiar nature of the Chinese patrilineal system, whereby men were actually members of a lineage and kind of ultimately belonged to their ancestors, and women belonged to the men, as James Watson put it, or to the household, which was dominated by the men. It was therefore considered increasingly unacceptable to sell sons as slaves, even in case of extreme debt or poverty, but perfectly acceptable to sell daughters. or even in some places wives on the event of the death of their husbands. So you could sell a son to be adopted, but you had to make sure they ended up in a relatively advantageous situation. But there are actually markets in daughters in many times in places which the daughters could be bought pretty much for whatever you want, the daughter, slave, concubine, wife, or prostitute, depending on the buyer's whim. It was not impossible, says James Watson, for a girl to be purchased as a daughter in infancy, exploited like a slave during adolescence, and married to one of her buyer's own sons in adulthood. And as I say, there was constant attempts by the government to suppress this kind of thing, as indeed there still is, because there's periodic scandals about this sort of thing still break out, about the sale of girls. Often they were quite young, they seem to especially correspond to those periods where commercial life was most could be said to be most flourishing, particularly the Song and Ming dynasties, and which are also the periods where women's status and women's freedom generally is seen as declining. But something like that dynamic of, on one hand, commoditization of the poor, in this very literal sense, of poor women and seclusion in reaction to that of richer ones, seems to be happening almost everywhere. And commercial debt plays a key role in affecting that. I mean, most of these people were ultimately sold because of the need to pay debts. Thus, while for the landed classes marriage became unsurprisingly largely about control of land, for the laboring classes it remained largely about the control of labor, and women's labor in particular. Commercial debt played a key role in affecting the transition between older marriage arrangements, which largely had to do with renegotiating relations between social groups, and the incipient commoditization of labor. Now, considering the way the debate began of this League of Nations, a debate about whether bridewell should be considered a form of slavery and made illegal in European colonial dependencies, it's perhaps not entirely surprising that anthropologists have tended to be a little bit squeamish about following such matters through to their logical conclusions, as evidenced by Goody's largely holding back from dealing with marriage arrangements among the Eurasian poor at all. He has this huge fat book, and there's almost nothing about lower caste people in India, or poor people in Mesopotamia. It's almost all elite examples. It's largely been Marxist and feminist anthropologists who've been willing to explore such territory systematically. And in fact, one could very easily make the case that one reason kinship has sort of disappeared as the primary sub-object of anthropology. And I've always felt that this is a bit of a scandal. It used to be 30, 40 years ago, if there's like this special thing that anthropologists have, it's kinship. We can do these diagrams that no one else can understand. It's sort of our equivalent of equations for economists. It's our thing, our special knowledge. And it's like anthropology threw that away, You talk to the average person trained in anthropology nowadays with a PhD, they probably never had a kinship course. If you talk about matrilateral prescriptive marriage customs, they just don't know what you're talking about. So how did that happen? And I think that the answer to that is that, starting in the 70s and 80s, feminists made a very strong case that you can't talk about this stuff anymore, except without taking into consideration power and domination, sexism, compulsory heterosexuality, a whole series of issues that hadn't really been discussed. These are really power systems and systems of exploitation. So the result was that most male anthropologists just said, okay, we won't talk about them at all anymore. You girls can go talk about that. Right? And as a result, it sort of faded away, rather embarrassingly, in my opinion. All right, so that's one. So debt is sort of the wedge which allows social relations to be essentially commoditized, and particularly women's labor. Now, I also want to talk about the deep genealogy of wage labor. This is part 2. In this essay, I want to pursue the relation of debt and commoditization of labor by looking at the history of the wage relation itself. Considering the dominance of the wage system today, it's actually remarkably under-researched. I mean, there's a lot of studies of slavery. I mean, just compare how many studies of slavery there are to how many studies of wage labor in antiquity or the Middle Ages. You realize, okay, it's true slavery was actually a more important institution, but it's just like, 50 to 1. There's enormous amounts of one and surprisingly little on the other. I can't think of a single book-length study, somebody tell me if I'm wrong, about forms of wage contract in the ancient or medieval worlds. And insofar as information about wage contracts is to be found, it's largely inside the literature that's about slavery. And that's, of course, significant in itself, since for most of history, the two institutions were, in fact, closely related. This is well documented in ancient Greece, although I think often people draw the wrong conclusions. Essentially, Jonathan Friedman came to the famous conclusion that ancient Greek slavery was really a form of capitalism, whereas I would rather make the argument that capitalism is really a transformation of slavery. But it is certainly certain that slaves and wage laborers were essentially overlapping categories in most of ancient Greek history. A freeborn Athenian, or Corinthian for that matter, of the 4th or 5th centuries BC didn't consider being paid to work for a government as in any way shameful, right? That's because if it's one's own government, one is essentially working for oneself. If one's doing jury duty or building a monument. Athens wasn't considered an abstraction. Athens, it was the Athenians. And if I am an Athenian, I'm working for the Athenians, I'm working for myself. Even hiring oneself out as a mercenary to a foreign potentate was sort of an honorable thing to do. However, hiring oneself out to a private citizen in the same community was totally different. And people really avoided that because it essentially marks you as a slave. As a result, almost all early wage labor contracts that we are aware of appear to have, in fact, been contracts for slave rental. These arrangements could, as Friedman pointed out, be quite sophisticated, involving the allocation of money wages split between slave and owner to workers maintained in workshops producing for the market. In many ways, they did approximate what we're used to thinking of as capitalist arrangements, but they were an extension of the institution of slavery itself. Now, some of the world systems theorists have generalized from this. Chase, Dunn, and Hall, in their book Rise and Demise, argue that capitalism, and like most world systems analysts, are defining capitalism in Brodelian terms, as basically the use of money to make more money. Capitalism, they say, tends to develop within what they call autonomous capitalist city-states on the semi-peripheries of world systems. The examples they give are Dilmun, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, Malacca, Venice, Florence, Genoa, Antwerp, and the cities of the Hanseatic League. Even that point is actually an extension of something that a point Brodel had made, that if capitalism can only emerge if merchants and financiers are able to ally themselves with governments, then small mercantile states is where that's most likely to happen. What's interesting for my own purposes is that these are also the kind of places where one is historically most likely to encounter the densest concentrations of chattel slaves, even in periods where chattel slavery had largely been eliminated elsewhere, such as the Middle Ages, and also particularly as a factor of production. So it's those areas where you find sort of nascent capitalists sort of allying with or taking over governments. That's a place where you see the most chattel slaves, but it's also where you see something that resembles wage labor emerging from within the institution of slavery in much the way as you saw happen in ancient Greece. And I think historians have largely missed this because if you look at the exceptions to this, they're mostly in Northern Europe. European mercantile city-states were somewhat anomalous in this regard. Southern Europe actually still fits the pattern fairly well. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, Florence, Pisa were not only centers of commerce and finance, as we know, they were precisely the part of medieval Europe where slavery, classic chattel slavery, held on the longest. It's true it was contested. In the 12th century, for example, the slaves that had been employed making cloth by monasteries I believe it was in Venice, were largely replaced by guild labor. Actually, this was across Italy. After that, Italian slaves were rarely employed for producing for the market. But that's largely because that was around the time that the use of servile labor for producing for the market shifted away from Italy itself to what were essentially colonial possessions, particularly sugar plantations in Crete and Cyprus, in what many believe provided the model that was later exported first to the Canary Islands and then to the Caribbean. I think all of this happened because in Europe, much unlike the rest of the mercantile city-states elsewhere in the world at that time, almost all of which were part of the larger Islamic ecumene, if you want to call it that, where Islam and Islamic law was a sort of medium of trade or arbiter of trade, and enforced a strict division between war and commerce. In Europe, war and commerce was kind of mixed together in a way that really didn't happen elsewhere. I talk about this a bit in the Debt book, which is why the sort of exploitation of servile labor for market purposes by either funded by or directly by mercantile city-states tended to happen as part of like military and colonial ventures, whereas such things in other places happen within the city-states themselves. If you go back to the trading world of the Indian Ocean during the same period, one finds with remarkable consistency labor arrangements similar to those of the ancient world, where it's actually almost entirely slaves who are doing wage labor. Insofar as we observe wage labor contracts, they are actually slave rental, either because the owners would rent their slaves out directly or because slaves who had achieved a certain amount of autonomy would be allowed to find work on their own and then be expected to turn over a share of the proceeds to their owners. And again, going back to my own fieldwork in Madagascar, which has sort of marginal part of that larger Indian Ocean trading world. Well, the port cities were part of it, and I was in the highlands, which is sort of plugged into that. That was actually the principal way of organizing labor in the 19th century. It began in port cities like Tamatave and expanded to the highlands. And by the 19th century, even Quaker missionaries active in the abolition movement had to protest abolitionists at home who complained that they were all basically having all their work done by slaves or being carried around by slaves on palanquins and whatnot. They would say, look, we would employ free labor, but it's impossible because nobody who isn't a slave is willing to work for wages. We pay these guys. And in the 19th century, the transport industry throughout Madagascar was entirely dominated by slave porters who formed effective unions. And those porters, in theory, had to turn over a percentage of their wages to the owners, but in practice, they often didn't. This is one contemporary missionary source I found. Slaves enjoy considerable freedom of action. While theoretically without rights, practically they enjoy a good many. As there are no made roads and no wheeled vehicles in Madagascar, travelers are carried in palanquins, and baggage is conveyed by men. Slaves are permitted by their masters to hire themselves out as servants and laborers, to carry baggage and messages to and from the coast, to go on long journeys with travelers, in fact to do anything for which they can obtain wages. Sometimes the master receives a portion of the wages thus earned. Sometimes he receives nothing at all. But in that case, the slave has frequently to hire someone else to take his place and fulfill his share of the personal service when required. So here you have slaves not only hiring themselves, but hiring other slaves, because only slaves will work for wages, to work for their own master. And this, provides a fascinating glimpse for one way that slave labor could become commoditized. Another thing which always fascinated me about the Malagasy system, I've never had a chance to write about this, but I will someday, is that they had a partible inheritance system in Madagascar, which meant that slaves quickly came to be divided up. So, if you have 8 children, each one gets 1/8 share of the slaves. So it's not at all uncommon to see contracts for the sale of 1/16 of a slave, or a slave who owns 3/4 of himself, slowly buying himself back from his various owners. What this actually meant in terms of labor arrangements is really unclear from the sources. There is occasional references to division of days, that slaves would have to sort of wander around from one place to another if their various owners lived in different places. But it's easy to see how under such conditions, since slaves were itinerant anyway, systems of substitutions like that could become commonplace, and slave labor was already broken into units and commoditized in various ways, which may lent itself to further doing so through the payment of wages. Anyway, Malagasy slaves in the late 19th century achieved an unusual level of autonomy, but similar arrangements, usually more strictly enforced, could be observed in a lot of other places. The Swahili city-states are a good example. Most of our sources are pretty late, 19th century or early 20th, but they're very consistent. Here, the main employers appear to have been Hadramis, small-scale entrepreneurs originally from Yemen, notorious for purchasing slaves so as to hire them out as either craftsmen or dock workers, then collecting a share of the wages. So it's the same deal. Precisely the same pattern appears in most of the major cosmopolitan port cities of Southeast Asia, where early European sources almost always describe the bulk of the population as slaves. This, as we'll see, might be exaggerated because most of the population of these port cities seem to have been made up of people in a slightly more ambiguous condition of debt bondsmen or personal dependents of large magnates, rather than, say, war captives. And so often they made a distinction. They were all sort of collapsed as slaves, but the real slaves are the ones who were captured in war, who had fewer rights and lower status. Nonetheless, legal documents make clear that wage labor contracts were basically consisted of agreements to rent one's servile dependents, or for servile dependents to rent themselves. This is Anthony Reed. In none of these trading cities in the 16th and 17th centuries can we identify a class of independent urban artisans or laborers free to work for wages, or not to work. If we compare wage rates given in European sources with the cost of a day's rice, we find a very high labor cost. So people were paid a lot, but this is not a free market wage paid to the worker, but the cost of hiring bondsmen from a master. This is a quote that Reed quotes. It was their custom to rent slaves. They pay the slave a sum of money, which he gives to his master, and then they use that slave that day for whatever work they wish. The laws of Malacca similarly give many examples of the legal implication of hiring or borrowing slaves, but none of any other type of labor contract. Same thing in colonial Java. There were actually free wage laborers in colonial Java. It appears around Batavia in the early colonial period, but it's almost exclusively confined to this sort of semi-criminal masterless men from the countryside who are available for seasonal agricultural labor during the colonial period, people who were otherwise viewed by the authorities as derelicts and thugs. The bulk of wage labor, however, continued to be performed by slaves there as well. So, and finally, it hardly seems coincidental that plantation slavery, which in historical terms is one of the rarest forms of the institution, tends to appear precisely in the same context where one has mercantile city-states and the emergence of wage labor from within slavery. Outside of from the ancient world, one might point here to the slave plantations encouraged by the Omanis in 19th century East Africa, the pepper plantations in Sumatra managed by merchants from Aceh and Malacca. Still, it was only really unlucky unfree laborers who ended up working on plantations. And here's where debt comes in. This is very interesting. In Southeast Asia, at least, and I suspect this is true in a lot of places, most wage laborers actually got themselves into that situation, sometimes intentionally by manipulating debt. Since debt peons both maintained many of the rights of free people, but were formally dependents on some local notable, who were typically were typically seen as far higher status than the sort of criminals and vagabonds who were available for casual hire, if indeed anyone was. The logic seems to have been this. Since working under another's orders, particularly on an ongoing basis, is by definition a relation of dependency and non-freedom, only those in formally dependent state could really do it. As a result, it was not at all uncommon for someone attracted to work in a bustling port city like Malacca or Aceh or Makassar, to take out a loan so as to render themselves dependent on some local grandee, who would then hire him out and collect a share of the proceeds. So if you want to come to town and sort of get a piece of the action, you intentionally take out a loan to make yourself into a debt peon, and then the guy who lent you the loan becomes your agent. In fact, he might even take the money that he got on the loan and hire debt peons of his own, or servants, or buy people who are already slaves. According to the Cambridge World History of Slavery, debt bondage was by far the most common form of slavery. Slaves were both hired and traded on open markets, and slaves themselves could participate in such markets by purchasing slaves for themselves, thereby lessening their own labor obligations, much like the Malagasy people were hiring slaves to fill in for themselves. Of course, debt bondsmen could also be sold off by their masters, but there was a social obligation not to sell debt bondspeople outside their own natal society. So, as you might imagine, these things become really complicated very quickly, with the same individuals acting as both creditors and debtors, masters and slaves, employers and employees, often in the same transactions and at the same time, much like the Malagasy slaves. But debt was absolutely critical in sort of affecting the transformation from one status to another. I think at the root of all these complicated machinations, however, there's a really simple paradox. And I think the fundamental contradiction is the very idea of a free contract in which two parties agree not to be in a relation of equality anymore. Because any contractual arrangement assumes two parties, at least some kind of formal or legal equality exists for them to enter into a contractual agreement to begin with. But how do you frame it if what they're agreeing to is not to be in a relation of formal equality anymore? And at least while the terms of the contract apply. In that way, in purely formal terms, debt contracts and wage labor contracts are actually very similar because they're both agreements between two ostensibly equal parties to enter into a relation of extreme inequality for a specific period of time under certain specific conditions. And I think it's this similarity which allowed debt to be the conceptual wedge through which wage labor became socially, morally, and politically possible. After all, in most societies, the idea of temporary voluntary reduction to a status that was only otherwise familiar in relations of either patriarchal authority within the household or outright chattel slavery, an institution which was always, at least on principle, conceived to be founded on right of conquest, would have been either morally outrageous or simply inconceivable. One does not normally think to rent oneself out as either a daughter or a slave. It was the absolute quality of the moral power of debt, and this is the thing that always fascinated me when I was writing the book, is how the morality of debt seems to have this astounding capacity to trump any other type of morality, so that people will accept things that they would just never accept under any other circumstance if it's what's necessary to pay one's debts. That's what made it so well suited to transform labor itself into a tradable economy, either through the manipulation of marriage payments in the case of women's labor, or the case of wage contracts, which were mostly, if not exclusively although not exclusively, undertaken by men. Okay, so now part 3, wage labor in Northern Europe, or free labor as we like to call it. The notion of free wage labor creates, if anything, an even greater conceptual challenge, because in a purely technical sense, in fact, the usual creditor-debtor relation is actually reversed, right? And we don't really think about it this way, but like who owes who? Unless you have a company store and you intentionally indebt your workers, which was often done, but in the classic scenario where you sign on, you get a good job, you do the work, you get paid at the end of the week. Well, most of the time you're doing the work, you're actually the creditor and the boss is the debtor because he owes you money for your work. You've already done the work and he's owing you money. So, if anybody's the debtor, it's the boss, right? But in fact, during that time, you're actually subordinated to the will of your debtor. Now, this creates a rather confusing situation, which is one reason we don't even like to think about it that way. But what I'd like to argue is that there was a certain amount of conceptual work had to be done in order for it not to occur to us that actually the boss is the debtor who owes something to the worker. And so I want to end by talking a little bit about that and how that happened, and the very interesting history of what wage labor actually is in social, legal, and political terms. How it was that in Northern Europe, one area which didn't have chattel slavery in the late Middle Ages, or very little, and debt peonage was actually fairly limited, was also the place where free labor came to be seen as alienable, and above all, where it was considered normal for free men and women to place themselves completely under another person's authority and under their orders. In contemporary law, that principle of subordination is sometimes referred to as the principle of control, or another phrase you see a lot is the open-ended duty of obedience that a hired laborer owes to their employer. And it still provides a profound conceptual challenge for these very reasons. According to the Sage Handbook of Industrial Relations, for example, the term contract of employment, or in French, contrat de travail, only entered general usage in the 1880s, very late. The main impetus for its adoption was an argument by employers in larger enterprises that the general duty of obedience should be read into all industrial hirings. And the core of the concept was a notion of subordination, in which the open-ended duty of obedience was traded off in return for the acceptance and absorption by the enterprise of a range of social risks. So this open-ended duty of obedience implied that a hired worker was obliged to do whatever he was told to do by his or her employer, insofar as those orders didn't involve either violating some other existing law or some specific provisions of their contract. And in exchange, the enterprise accepted responsibility for consequences of decisions that the worker could no longer make, for example, if he got injured. In fact, even this formulation was not really accepted in the Anglophone world, that this was just a free contract, until much later. And it's actually really surprising. In the United Kingdom, employment disputes, at least for industrial and manual work, were not generally treated under contract law until the rise of union power in the welfare state in the 1940s. Before that, they were largely treated under common law traditions governing relations between masters and servants, which trace back to the Middle Ages. In the US, actually, that's still the case. You're still dealing with a common law tradition that goes, it's still master and servant law, basically, that governs labor relations. So, in fact, the principle of open-ended obedience, as legal historians like Simon Deacon emphasize, itself can be traced back to the obedience that medieval servants owed to their masters, which were again tempered only by force of custom, social expectations of reasonable treatment, and any particular arrangements among the parties that, to a service contract that might have been made. However, in the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, the responsibilities involved in such arrangements were assumed to be a lot more mutual. Most notably, service contracts tended to be yearly, and during the year, masters were expected not only to provide agreed-on wages, bed and board for workers, but to do so whether or not they actually found any work for the guy to do. This is very important. So, if you're a master craftsman, you get 3 apprentices, and there's a bad market, nobody wants to buy your gloves. Maybe you're just sitting around, but you still have to pay the people. You also had to take care of them if they were sick or injured, became pregnant, whatever might happen. The importance of this medieval concept of service, actually, and the eventual emergence of capitalist labor regimes, I think cannot be underestimated. It's something I've been banging on about for years in various ways, but I think it really should be underlined here. Even though it's a topic that's weirdly neglected by a lot of economic historians, not all, but if you look at all the sort of various Marxist transition debates, I guess starting with Sweezy Dobb, I guess was the first one, and leading up at least to the Brenner debate, which is all about whether capitalism starts as a top-down or a bottom-up phenomena. Do you have to look at commerce and finance and transformations therein, which gradually affected on-the-ground relations, or did it happen from the bottom up? Was it a transformation of rural class relations from below? You'd think that, like in that argument, you'd have endless discussions of what the from below work arrangements actually were, right? No. There's almost none. You have these like statistical discussions and constantly throwing around the word wages, wage rates, but it's assumed that like what the word wage means is self-evident, which is very clearly not the case. At the same time, detailed studies that have been made of what wages could have meant in the late Middle Ages and early modern period show that it actually could mean a lot of different things. oft-cited statistic that about a third of the population of late medieval England was dependent on wages for at least a large share of their livelihood. And this appears to have been true, but what wages meant in that context could be a lot of different things. And if you look at the details of the arrangements, often people would be hired to do a specific job, and they would bring their apprentices or their servants or their kids along with them. They would actually have their own hirelings. So it looks a lot more in many of these cases like something, the modern equivalent would be hiring a plumber or something like that. He's not exactly a wage laborer who's under your direction. They're people with their own skills, mysteries as they were called at the time, which you didn't know what they were. Or even if you did know what they were formed their own teams and negotiated with you and were essentially independent contractors, we would now call them, more than anything else. The ones who weren't were servants who were hired for certain periods of time, typically a year. They're also day laborers, that's important. But day laborers tended to avoid ongoing contracts and move around from job to job, preferring short-term engagements. But they were famous for being pretty hardcore negotiators in terms of conditions and employment, often to their great advantage and the distress of moralists who were constantly complaining that these guys were overpaid, especially disturbing to moralists because they to some degree overlapped with the murkier population of, dead I said, described them as the beggars, harlots, cat purses, hawkers, peddlers, fortune tellers, minstrels, and other such masterless men and women of ill repute, sort of like the ones in Java who did the day labor, sort of merged with the criminal classes, and as a result they could extract quite a bit. So you have that, you have the sort of independent contractors, then you have actual service contracts. Service contracts were typically young people, not always. Manorial estates would have yearly servants who were adults. But all over Northern Europe, at least since the Middle Ages, what's been called the North European marriage pattern was characterized by what's been called life cycle service. And the majority of the population, male and female, not just craftspeople, but peasants, even nobles, were expected to spend most of their adolescence laboring as a servant in another family's household, typically in a household just slightly wealthier than their own. As Anne Kuzmal writes about servants and husbandry, master and servant customarily sealed their agreement with the offering and taking of a token payment, the earnest, hiring penny, fastening penny, or God's penny. I always like that phrase, God's penny. The contract implicitly bound the servant to serve the master for a year and to obey his reasonable commands. And it bound the master to maintain the servant for the year and to pay the wages agreed upon, whether or not there was daily work for the servant and whether or not the servant remained fit to work. The master's authority was thus tempered by custom. The word reasonable appears a lot in these things. Servants are expected to obey reasonable orders in exchange for reasonable wages. So sort of communal standards was held to settle all of these matters. In much the way that sort of Jim Scott's idea of moral economy, there was ongoing communal feeling about what's a reasonable amount to expect to have a reasonable lifestyle. During this time, of course, servants were literally considered members of the master's family, since family was conceived not as a kinship unit so much as a household, a unit of authority under the aegis of a single head of household. They're also, of course, learning their future trades and how to comport themselves as proper adults, and finally trying to accumulate enough of a nest egg so they could eventually marry and create their own farm, shop, or household. As a result, for the bulk of the medieval English population, this is, I think, critical, and it really hasn't been thought about enough. Wage labor under the supervision of an employer was something one does for the first 10 or 15 years of one's working life, and has little to do the way adults were expected to treat one another. Because remember, most of these other wage laborers are not really being supervised. I think one must be careful because the concept of service was used in a lot of different ways. You think about it, it's a very conceptually rich term. It can, and it was already a very conceptually rich term with a lot of different meanings already by the 12th and 13th centuries. spent a lot of time poring over the OED and looking at different, ways the words serve, service, servant were used. Basically, all hierarchical arrangements were imagined as forms of service, starting with divine service, of course, directed at God, but continuing through feudal service, which is the basic framework of the political order. Vassals owed various carefully specified services, typically the provision of a certain number of service knights, but also non-military sergeants, in exchange for tenure. Peasants, of course, owed a variety of services to their own lords, but the interesting thing about all those forms of service is the exact nature of feudal and manorial services tended to be really, really carefully specified. They weren't really open-ended. They were often exactly custom set them down to the exact detail. In other words, feudal arrangements tended to be the very opposite of this kind of open-ended duty of obedience characteristic of lifestyle servants and later of employees in commercial or industrial enterprises. But the fact that even high-born families were expected to send their teenage sons and daughters to serve at court, so that even the powerful all had some experience of domestic servants, must have ensured that that's what remained the paradigm for all other forms of service. The word was used really broadly, but the sort of conceptual center of it was domestic servants. And this is why, common usage at the time, again, calling on the OED, includes, if you look at the verb to serve in medieval examples, to be a servant, to perform the duties of a servant, to attend upon, to render habitual obedience to become the extension of another's will or purposes, but also to wait upon a person at table, hence to set food before or to help a person to food. There's a million different variations of serving as in giving food to, the latter of which is already by at least 1362 extended to attend to the request of a customer in a shop. So to serve a customer actually comes before, say, serving one's country, becoming a public service, serving in the armed forces, which is all rather comes later with the absolutist state. So the paradigmatic act of service is serving food. And you can look at the history of the word waiter is actually really telling there. It's one common term for a domestic servant, but particularly among elite circles, you have ladies in waiting, gentlemen waiters, not only waited at their lord or lady's table, but were waiting for their inheritance so they didn't have to do it anymore, to acquire the means to marry and become the master or mistress of their own household and get servants of their own. So I think what's important here is that it brings together three key features that I think are intrinsic to the notion of service as it existed at the time, which is still kind of lingering in the background of the term used now when we use the terms like goods and services, right? First of all, that it involved an open-ended duty of obedience. Second, that it was educational, at least in the sense of being formative of character. And third, that it was conceived in terms of what we would now call caring labor. Right? The servant attended to the physical needs of his or her master or mistress, who fed him or her, who in turn was expected to care for the servant as required, as they would any other member of their family. So the transition from a system like that to one marked by permanent wage labor, as began to happen with the breakdown of the guild system in the 16th and 17th centuries, meant that a very large number of servants, particularly apprentices and journeymen, suddenly found themselves in a position where they could never become masters, and thus found themselves trapped in permanent social adolescence. This had a number of really profound social effects, some of which I've written about elsewhere. For example, I point out that it's almost certainly no coincidence, I think, that it's exactly the period where employment could no longer be conceived as a process of character formation and education leading to one's eventual full moral personhood when one gets a household of one's own. This is exactly the time when the employing classes, who have essentially shut the proletariat out of such social adulthood, suddenly develop an intense interest in the moral reformation of the poor. So they're basically trying to do the same thing through other means. I mean, you look at medieval texts, middle-class people really couldn't care less about the moral behavior of the poor. But suddenly it becomes an obsession right around the period where this old service system breaks down. Legal historians have gradually been able to reconstruct how the terms and conditions were transformed in the centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution. Government played a key role here. And it's actually very much analogous to what happened with debt. In the debt book, I observed, and I was basically following the research here of Craig Muldrew, that in most English communities in the late Middle Ages, cash was very rarely deployed in everyday transactions. Villagers and townsfolk alike preferred to rely on complex credit systems, which meant that it's sort of considered normal for everybody to be at least a little bit in debt to everybody else. Debt was sort of seen as the lifeblood of sociability and the sort of material or immaterial, aspect of community itself, or of communal love. And at the same time, starting in Elizabethan times, more and more members of the emerging middle classes began to turn to the courts to enforce debts. And people used to lodge the debts in the courts, but they wouldn't actually go to the courts to enforce them. One reason for that was simply because the law was really harsh. In fact, a truly persistent creditor could have debtors imprisoned or even executed. And starting in the late 16th and early 17th century, a lot of people started doing that, which had this crazy paradoxical effect of something that had been considered the very substance of sociality itself was suddenly effectively criminalized. Now, around that same time, local courts also became really interested in regulating labor, which there had been some interest in by the government in the wake of the Black Death, but it really starts kicking in then with the Statute of Artificers. But as Deacon points out, for example, the initial impulse to do so had to do with the peculiar nature of English welfare system at the time. The Settlement Act essentially insisted that elderly, incapacitated laborers, anyone in need of relief, had to go to their own parish. They couldn't, demand relief in someone else's parish. Exceptions were granted only for those who could demonstrate they'd undertaken yearly contracts as servants in the parish in which they currently resided. Now, obviously that meant that it was up to the courts to decide who had a real contract and who didn't, which is interesting because previous to that, as Cosmo and others have pointed out, and Cooper, the whole domain of service, which was basically the entire adolescent population, were essentially off the books in terms of as far as the government was concerned. They had almost nothing to do with them. There was some occasional interference in apprentices contracts and things like that. But basically, they didn't even know who these people were. Suddenly, with the welfare legislation being what it was, government, local courts and magistrates had to decide who was really employed. The conditions of employment were put under the microscope, in effect. And this was happening at the same time as the famous enclosure movements and all the sort of, as endless Marxist scholars have documented, cottagers were being driven from their natal villages. The existing floating semi-criminal population, casual laborers, sort of swollen by those guys, was being suppressed by ever harsher vagrancy laws, which are essentially trying to force as many people as possible into these one-year household servant contracts. At the same time, since welfare responsibilities were being shifted to the parish, the service relation came to be defined in much more one-sided fashion as being defined around the master's unconditional authority. And here's a quote. In this way, the settlement laws helped to initiate the open-ended duty of obedience, which later came to characterize the contract of service. Although a servant could not be made to work, quote, unreasonable hours of the night, and he is punished if he profanes the Sabbath day, it was very good. It was determined that a right of control and authority, at least so far as it relates to the general discipline and government of the servant, must reside in the master at all times during the continuance of the service. This is one of the criteria for who actually was a servant and actually lived where. So this was the primary criterion for judging whether a relationship of employment existed. It meant that that element of unconditional obedience became both extremely important and enforced by the state. And this increased dramatically over time. By the 18th century, when households and workplaces increasingly separated, and owners of mills, mines, and similar enterprises began employing large numbers of wage laborers working regular hours, that was the criterion they chose for who's really working for who. control, authority. At the same time, though, magistrates were being granted ever more powers to intervene in different types of employer-employee relationships. Under the statute of artificers, it was pretty limited. And courts had been given the right to set up maximum wages and regulate relations between masters and servants in husbandry since Elizabethan times, but it was really just right before the Industrial Revolution that it was extended to everyone else with the Masters and Servants Law of 1747 and a series of other laws that followed in the decade or two afterwards. So that same supervisory function was extended to artificers, handicraftsmen, miners, colliers, keelmen, pitmen, glassmen, potters, and other laborers employed for any certain time or in any other manner. Which not only thus extended the principle of open-ended obedience to skilled craftsmen who'd previously been more of the independent contractors, but allowed the courts to intervene on the employer's behalf by imposing fines and even up to 3 months imprisonment on any workers found to have absconded from their yearly contractual responsibilities. So suddenly these people who had been hired, because they had certain skills that you didn't have on a part-time basis, were being forced by courts to take on these year-long contracts where the employer no longer really had any responsibilities to them, but they were expected to have an absolute right of obedience to their employer. Now, what does this all have to do with that? Here I can only make a series of suggestions, but I think it's really interesting and significant that, one effect of punitive government interference in these master-servant laws was to nullify the advantage gained by workers from the fact that they were, as I pointed out, creditors to their employees rather than the other way around. You look at that God's penny, it was presented to the servant to sign a contract. It's now called a material consideration in the same way that, even if you have a contract where you don't pay someone money, you have to give them 1p so that you can say money changed hands or it's a real contract. Well, that goes back to this, which was a sort of pledge where you give them God's penny or an earnest and as a promise of future payment. But that's exactly the same thing that a debtor does to a creditor. So it's the same thing, you give God's penny. So essentially employers, masters would actually pose themselves as, not as the creditors, but as the servants, as the debtors to their servants, at least in that formal way. Now, this might not have had a lot of practical implications, but it had certain moral ones. And it did, and it probably had something to do with why it was that servants were in such relatively advantageous situations that people were constantly complaining in the late Middle Ages, that essentially they were in a really advantageous negotiating position, were constantly getting overpaid and coddled. And thus sparking endless and apparently only unevenly successful government attempts to hold down wages. Government intervention in the 17th and 18th century particularly aimed to destroy both the moral and economic basis of working class power, at the same time as it also aimed to reinforce the absolute right of employers to dispose of workers as they wished. For instance, a key 18th century ruling held that if a worker is fired for any act of disobedience or quit before the agreed on date, he forfeited the right to collect any wages owed for work he might already have done. And this is really important because it often took them ages to pay people. Would be waiting and waiting, sometimes 6 months to a year. So they would forfeit anything the moment the judge agreed that you did something that disrespected your absolute obligation to obey orders. In other words, so the employer's authority was held to trump the employee's status as a creditor. Such precedents were maintained and even augmented when the Masters and Servants Law was replaced in Victorian times by the Employers and Workmen Act of 1875, which continued to give the courts the rights to intervene in the terms of employment contracts in a way that almost entirely unprecedented in any other form of contractual law. I don't know if anyone's read Carol Pateman, wrote a book called The Sexual Contract, where she points out that marriage and employment contracts are similarly weird because any other form of contract, it's the two parties who negotiate the contract who basically make up the terms. And marriage is extremely, so it's significant considering we've been looking at marriage transactions and employment transactions, because those are the two forms of contract where you can't do that. You can't say, these two people want to marry those three people. I mean, even if they want to, they can't. Almost everything about the marriage contract is already set out and can't be changed by the people actually making the contract. It's completely different than a commercial contract, right? So similarly, employment contract, there's no way that like a government would come and impose fines and or lock up somebody who was a business partner who, like, somebody complained had violated the contract. It might make them pay something, but they wouldn't, impose punitive sanctions. But they did that all the time to employment contracts, and the nature of what could be done, or the whole part of the duty, you couldn't negotiate that away. The duty of obedience, that was already there, similar to the marriage contract. So, and in fact, they would regularly impose fines on workers for insubordination, which would cancel out any debts of unpaid wages that the employer might have owed them. Workers who insisted on attempting to withdraw from or negotiating contracts were not only stripped of what they'd already earned, but could be threatened with debtor's prison. So in that way, it was a reversal of the debt relation which actually made this kind of generalized relation of subordination, which lies at the heart of what we call free labor, possible. So, and then, these are only provisional notes for what could be, if I ever have the time, a much more ambitious and systematic project of research. I'd like to very much pursue this someday. But I think it's enough to reveal a persistent link between debt and the commoditization of labor. The European case, unfree labor in the colonies, became the basis for the creation of fortunes that were to become the main object of the first stock exchanges and financial markets, while back at home, the rise of free labor, as it was termed, a term only used to refer to free wage labor, right, was made possible largely by a legal regime that effectively redefined creditors as debtors. As in the case of the transformation of local credit systems that occurred around the same time, this required a great deal of government intervention into what had previously been considered market transactions. But markets which, if left to their own devices, led to outcomes almost precisely the opposite of what modern-day market enthusiasts imagine they would have produced. Modern labor law, which assumes a free contract between employer and employee, is really very recent and allows for such things as negotiated job descriptions, periods of notice, all that sort of thing, is really actually not a product of industrial or commercial workers at all, since they fell under the master-servant laws. It actually comes out of clerical or administrative workers who didn't fall under master-servants laws. So it's really the clerks who worked for the bosses who started demanding to have some rights as part of a labor contract. You could call this the Bob Cratchit effect, if you like. Because they weren't, you couldn't find them for breach of contract. And gradually, with unionization, the industrial workers started demanding the same thing, although that process was really only completed in the UK after World War II, and in the US it wasn't really completed at all. The achievement of full contractual status for industrial arrangements was not only historically quite recent, it was also historically quite brief, being followed by the rise of what's tellingly called the service economy, which appears to be driving the commoditization of labor up to and including that of thought and feeling in unprecedented directions. And I'll end on that.